Roman soldiers had taken the Apostle Paul to Caesarea in protective custody, and Festus, the Roman governor, came down to Caesarea to try the case to a tribunal where the Jews would accuse Paul and Paul would have an opportunity to answer for himself.
When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me?" But Paul said, "I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer, and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to the charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar." Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, "To Caesar you have appealed. To Caesar you shall go." Now when some days had passed, Agrippa, the king, and Bernice arrived at Caesarea greeting Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man left prisoner by Felix. When I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. And when the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked him whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, "I would like to hear the man myself." "Tomorrow," said he, "you will hear." May God bless his word to us today. Help us to give understanding and instruction from it so that we can apply it to our lives today. Amen. Well, this is part 58 of our study through the book of Acts. We're now up to chapter 24. 2 years have passed since Paul was taken to Caesarea and stood there before the previous Roman procurator, Felix, who had adjourned the trial on the pretext of needing testimony from the Roman commander in Jerusalem. But the truth was that Felix there refused to make a judgment, even though he knew that Paul was not guilty, and that Paul should go free. But Felix, the governor there, wants to gain advantage through Paul, either through bribery or by granting political favor to the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. And in the end, what happened, that he cruelly denied justice to Paul. He left him a prisoner when he was recalled to Rome. He was replaced by the new governor, whose name was Porcius Festus. You can read that in Acts 24:27, immediately preceding Acts 25. So my title today is "To Caesar You Shall Go." It's the dramatic statement that we see in our passage this morning, and it has a number of important consequences, which we will talk about today. So chapter 25, when you read chapter 25 here, it invites discussion, really, of the concept of justice. Paul, as we have pointed out previously, he's a child of two cultures. He is Jewish, but he's also Roman. And under the Jewish leadership of his day, we've seen that the Jewish system of justice was perverted and dysfunctional. Instead of following the well-established principles of justice that are in the law of Moses, Paul had been subjected to unjust violence, accusations, and abuse, and then being denied a fair trial by the Jews. It was only out of the Roman system, actually, that we've seen that there was any hope of justice that had been shown to Paul. But even then, we found that in the Roman system, there was political expediency and corruption and bribery, and that had prevented justice from being served as well. Justice delayed is often justice denied. And so Paul is forced to appeal to a higher court in order to seek justice and also, importantly, vitally, to progress on his mission to get to Rome. Now, Paul certainly had not been forgotten by the Jewish leaders over these 2 years in Jerusalem. And with the new governor, they clearly saw an opportunity, a new opportunity with a new Roman governor in charge. As soon as Festus arrived, the chief priests and the Jewish leaders immediately approached him. Number one on their list was to put pressure on him to condemn Paul, either by sentencing him prematurely, which you can see was revealed in verse 15, that they did that, or by summoning Paul to Jerusalem for yet another trial in verse 3. Allowing another opportunity, yet again, for Paul to be ambushed on the way. That old chestnut, they didn't really want to give up on that one. But then a couple of goes, they're going to try again. But this demonstrates the very real hatred certain Jewish leaders had for Paul. Not only had their hatred not abated over these 2 years, but their determination to pervert justice through deception and murder. It's just shocking. Because who are these guys? They were meant to uphold Jewish law. They're meant to represent the God of Israel. They're meant to be leading his people. And in stark contrast to this, Festus, the new Roman governor, initially at least, he resists their pressure and denies their requests in verse 4. And he shows that at least in the Roman justice system, that their concept of justice was much closer to biblical justice. Because he says in verse 16, when he'd been approached by the Jewish leaders, he says, I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and an opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. Now compare that to Proverbs 18:5, which says, it is not good to be partial to the wicked or to deprive the righteous of justice. And in particular, Proverbs 18:7, the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. So you can see that the language of the Roman, it reflects the language in the law, in the Jewish law, and yet the Jews are not following it. At least the Romans are talking about it, but they also have their failures. Now, Festus, by all reports, seemed to have been a much better man than either his predecessor Felix or even his successors. He was a governor that was highly praised by the Jewish historian Josephus. Judea had been overrun with bandits, and during his small time of a couple of years, he subdued the bandits. There was a high disarray in the finances, but Festus restored fiscal order. So rather than procrastinating, when Festus arrives, he gets right into it. He makes his way to Jerusalem after only arriving 3 days in the area. He goes straight up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with the city, that influential, powerful city under his care, and the people that he needs to work with. And he also officially arranges to hear Paul's case in Caesarea in less than 2 weeks. So he's really on the job and being effective. And of course, when he makes that change to hear Paul's case in Caesarea, unwittingly, Festus thwarts the Jewish leaders' plans to kill Paul and riot if he had agreed to Paul's transfer to Jerusalem. But looking at our passage a little bit more in detail, in our passage it firstly appears that we're having almost a repeat of what happened in chapters 24, 3, and 24. So we've got, again, the Jewish leaders seeking to kill Paul with the plot in the same manner that they did before, and an almost identical trial is convened in, again, the same place in Caesarea. The same accusations are made against Paul, and as before, they do so without proof or witnesses, and you can see that in verse 7. But what erupts in front of Festus when he's expecting a sort of a criminal case, he's expecting to hear crimes of sedition or murder or rioting, but instead what erupts in front of Festus is a religious case. One side says that Jesus was dead, another claimed that he was alive. That was the crux of it all when it was boiled down to it in verse 19. The Jews said Jesus is dead, and they ought to know because they're guilty. And Paul said that Jesus was alive, and he ought to know because Jesus appeared to him on the Damascus Road. So Festus is left confused and unsure about what to do in a case like this, which is not really something which is under his jurisdiction. However, yet again, the Roman procurator here is reluctant to pass judgment when he has the opportunity due to political expediency. Festus doesn't want to get off on the wrong foot politically with the Jewish leaders. He'd only been around for a matter of days, after all, and had already denied them once. And so, wanting to show them some favor, what does he do? He asks Paul if he would be willing to have his hearings up in Jerusalem. You can see that in verse 5, as the Jewish leaders had originally requested. So you can pick up that there's a lot of palace intrigue going on here. There are undercurrents swirling about underneath the surface. The Jews want Paul to be brought back up to Jerusalem. Festus wants to accommodate them because he doesn't want to cause any more friction with them right up front. And Paul knows that there's going to be another ambush plot if he is sent back to Jerusalem. But Paul has other considerations too. Paul had known for a while that the larger plan for him was to get to Rome. In Acts 23:11, just a couple of chapters back, Jesus had stood by him and encouraged him when he was in his cell that he was not going to die in Jerusalem, but that he was going to testify in Rome as he had testified in Jerusalem. Going back to Jerusalem would be going backwards. Paul's future lay in Rome. That's the long-range plan. That's the goal. Not so much for Paul to be set free. That's not really the goal. But ultimately, the goal is for him to get to Rome and testify to the truth about Jesus then. You remember, he had opportunity to be freed if he wanted to under Felix on the basis of a bribe. He refused that. He didn't want to be freed that method. So what does Paul do? He waits until an appeal was appropriate and convenient and timely. And it needed to be in a way that would be agreeable for the Roman procurator to be able to give his assent to it. It needed to be convenient for Festus. And this was the time, because Festus was under political pressure. The timing of Paul's appeal to Caesar now gives Festus a way out of a tricky situation that he finds himself in. Festus is wanting to uphold Roman law. He's already talked about how he wants to uphold Roman law, that it's not right to condemn a man without a proper trial. But on the other hand, he wants to please the Jews as well. And then he's got this weird case that he doesn't understand. What is he to do? So it's at this point that Paul decided to exercise what was his ancient Roman citizen's right, and that is for a trial in Rome rather than outside in the outer parts of the empire. He effectively appealed to a higher court, with the risk of a miscarriage of justice looming large in front of him, with this Festus starting to give way to have Paul shipped back to Jerusalem. So Paul declares in verse 10, I belong in Caesar's courts. This is the fitting place for me to be. I've done no wrong. And you know that, Festus. Paul did not refuse capital punishment if he deserved it. So Paul upholds the principle of justice. He says, look, if I deserve it, I'm not afraid to die. But the truth is, he did not deserve it. He was innocent. And so it was not right for him to be handed over to the Jews in any way by Festus. And so what does he do? He appeals to Caesar in verse 11. And Festus seems to have been caught by surprise by Paul's move. But after quickly confirming with his advisors, he realizes that this is a good solution for him. And so he declares in verse 12, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. And that means now, from this point forward, Paul is going to Rome. All expenses paid for. Well, the Romans no less. So he always wanted to go to Rome from ages ago. He didn't know how he was going to get there. And now here we see God's sovereignty apparent yet again. That God has arranged it. That not only is he going to be able to testify to all of these people, but the Roman Empire is actually going to take the trouble to be taking him all the way from Jerusalem, Caesarea, all the way to Rome. It's marvelous, marvelous to see the sovereignty and the purposes of God being played out. But Festus, he has another problem. He realized that it would be crazy, all crazy, to send a prisoner like Paul to Rome with no summary of the charges. Why is he being sent to Rome? I mean, he couldn't write a cover letter that said, yes, Emperor, sir, this man claims that a certain Jesus of Nazareth is alive, but all the leading authorities in Judea say that he's dead, so I immediately sent him to you. It's not going to work, is it? Because Caesar's just going to say, what? That's not against the law. Thinking that a man is alive when he's dead. There's no law about this. Why are you annoying me with things like this? I've got an empire to run. So that's not going to work. So Festus needs to work out what he's going to write. And it's at this point that the Herods, those people, those despicable dynasty, the Herods enter the story yet again. With a new governor in town, King Herod Agrippa II, who oversees some smaller provinces in the region, including Galilee, and there is some oversight and insight over Jewish religious matters, comes to pay his respects to his new Roman superior. Now, I think it would be helpful I think for you to know where this Herod fits into the Herod dynasty. So who is this guy, Herod Agrippa II? Well, his father, who surprisingly was Herod Agrippa I, he was the Agrippa, the Herod, who killed the Apostle James and pursued the Apostle Peter, which we looked at earlier in Acts. And then his father, so Herod Agrippa II's Herod Agrippa II's grandfather, he was the Herod who beheaded John the Baptist. And his great-grandfather, Herod the Great, was the Herod who got all of the children in Bethlehem less than 2 years old to be killed at the time when Jesus was born. So these Herods are a real monster blight and a representative of much callous, murderous, treacherous evil. Fortunately, Agrippa II is the last of them, this man here. But he's accompanied by his sister, Bernice. So who's Bernice? Well, Bernice, as we said, is his sister. She is the daughter of King Herod Agrippa I. Now, it seems that she's attached herself to a brother, and it's rumored that they have an incestuous relationship. So it's a bit murky and scandalous what goes on. But as we read on, and particularly next week, you'll see that Bernice is quite influential, and wherever King Herod Agrippa II is, Bernice is right there. So what's happening here? Festus decides to take advantage of Herod's experience and understanding about Jewish affairs. And he asks Herod, because he's here, to help him compose the letter that will be sent to the emperor regarding Paul's case. You can see that in verse 26. So it is arranged for Paul to give testimony before both Festus, King Agrippa, and Bernice the next day. And that's in our last verse on today's reading. And that's important because remember the prophecy that was made in Acts 9:15 when Paul was converted? Jesus said then that Paul would testify before kings. And here he is about to do so. And, of course, he's likely to now, with his appeal to Caesar, to go to Rome to testify before Caesar himself. Now, I just want to move on to an important part here that gets an issue that is prompted by these issues that we're looking at. It's important for us to explore the relationship, I think, between the believer, or the church, if you like, and the state, between the believer and the magistrate. This tension was used as a weapon against Jesus in Matthew 22, 17 to 21. If you can turn to that, please. Matthew 22, verses 17 to 21. Now, this verse is often cited as a foundational principle for the separation of church and state, suggesting that believers have dual responsibilities for both earthly government and divine authority. Now, you remember this situation in Matthew 22, 17 to 21, where Jesus is approached by a delegation who's saying, after buttering Jesus up and saying what a truthful man he is and that he doesn't fear men, they say, tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. And he said to them, therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So Jesus was asked if Jews should pay taxes to the Roman occupiers. Yes, would anger the Jewish people because they would be seen to be supporting the occupation and denying the right of the Jews to have their own nation. And a no would be considered treason against Rome. So they thought they had him. And when Jesus asked to see that denarius, which was a Roman coin, he pointed out that the coin bore Caesar's image and inscription, implying that the money was Caesar's property. That his image had been stamped upon it. And by instructing them to give to God what belongs to God, Jesus reminded them that while the coins had the stamp of Caesar's image, humans have the stamp of God's image upon them. Genesis 1:27. So therefore, their very lives and their ultimate allegiance belong to God, not to Caesar. Because both the Jews and the Christians were under the control of Rome. Paul did not object to this. He landed faithfully within both of those constraints. So Paul was a faithful Roman citizen. He was also a faithful Jewish man as well, and he was a faithful apostle of Christ. And so we also are encouraged to be faithful citizens in the UK and to be faithful Christians as well. Because the established authorities, Paul argues in Romans 13, that they are God's deacons, they are God's servants, they are appointed by God, and they're supposed to follow God's guidelines. That's what a servant does, right? A servant follows what their master says. But of course, we know that sometimes that doesn't happen. In Isaiah 5:20, it says, "Woe to those who call good evil and evil good, who substitute light for darkness and darkness for light, sweet for bitter and bitter for sweet." So what do you do when the servants, when the deacons, when the authorities rebel against God? When they start rewarding the evildoer and punishing the righteous? Well, in this case, the deacons, the servants, the leaders are in entire rebellion against God. And that's a different situation. But as long as the magistrates, as long as the authorities are maintaining law and order and are doing the right thing, upholding justice, which is clearly what Festus is generally doing when he says, "We don't execute a guy without hearing his side first," then that's maintaining godly order, and they are therefore to be obeyed and followed. But Caesar only has jurisdiction in a limited and finite way. As we've said, Caesar is God's servant. He's not his own servant. And that which has God's image on it has to be rendered to God, as Jesus taught in that Matthew 22:21 scripture. Who else bears God's image? Not just you. Not just your spouse. Not just your children. Who else? Well, Caesar. Caesar himself bears God's image. So you don't render Caesar to Caesar. You render Caesar to God. You, in your mind, in your thinking, your theology, in your worldview, have to understand that Caesar is what he is because he himself is under authority. Paul's a faithful Christian and apostle, but he's also called the faithful Roman. He's also the faithful Roman defined the way God would define it. Note what Paul says again in verse 8. Let's go back so you can see that. Verse 8. In verse 8 he says, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended anything at all." So Paul has been discharging all of his responsibilities in terms of all of the spheres that he operates in. So Paul says, in terms of the lawful order, I've violated anything Rome, the temple, I've violated none of this. So here's the question. Why are Christians who are dutiful citizens by the main experience, who are law-abiding. Why are Christians seen to be such of a threat to secular rulers? Well, the reason's not because Christians are lawless, because they're mostly law-abiding. It's rather because Christians understand that law must have a transcendent basis. And what I mean by that is the ultimate source of law and authority is beyond this world, beyond the people who are occupying the thrones and the positions of power. They are as much under authority as we are. If Christ is at the right hand of the Father, as he is, Caesar is under the authority of God. He bears God's image. We bear God's image. We are brothers. The only way we acknowledge his authority is by acknowledging that he is under authority. The megalomaniacal rulers don't like that, you see. They want to be over us without any authority above them. If there is no God above the state, then the state is God. If there is no God above Caesar, then Caesar is God. If there is no God above the emperor, then the emperor is God. Now, Caesar worship, emperor worship, began during the time of Jesus, and it was used as a necessary tool, particularly in the outer provinces, to help to maintain unity and order. But a lot of the emperors at the beginning were quite embarrassed about it. There's an interesting story that I read where one of the Caesars went into an amphitheater. Some people started chanting how divine he was, and he told them to knock it off. See, he was embarrassed by it. And there's the story of Vespasian, a later Roman emperor, as he was on his deathbed and he just said, "Oh, look, behold the death of a god before you," because he knew that it was ludicrous that he wasn't a god, that he was a mortal man himself. But there were other Caesars like Nero in his later life who really bought into that propaganda. And they were regular maniacal rulers. They lost it completely, and they insisted on being declared the ultimate Lord, to be recognized as God, and that is something that Christians cannot do or condone. Now, of course, these rulers are only God in their own imaginations. They're not actually God. They're pretending that there is no God above them, and they are pretending to be God. And they don't like it when Christians worship the true God of heaven, because this means that Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. But on top of that, when we consider consequences of being made in the image of God, it means when you're talking about your children, you can't render your children to Caesar. They have God's image on them. And so this actually establishes why you must bring up your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. They must get a Christian education. And yet so many people, of course, Christians are sending their kids to be taught, they're rendering their kids to be put under Caesar, to be taught secular thinking, when they must get a Christian education. They have God's image on them. That's why covenant parents supply Christian education to their children, because their children are created in the image of God. I want to conclude now by just telling you something that I personally really got out of this reading, because it can be disheartening sometimes, particularly now, today, when you survey the political landscape and you perceive the corruption and deception that is rife among leaders today. And they're also, with what's been happening with attacks on different countries, and people have been shocked that the international rule of law is being ignored and disregarded, and rather it seems the power of might seems to be winning the fight, and there is no recognition of an authority above he who thinks that he is the ruler of all. There seems to be a real lack of honest and upright leaders in power in our time. Major institutions that once were trusted are now viewed with suspicion. But this passage here demonstrates that in spite of this, God's purposes are not thwarted, and actually all rulers are indeed subject to him. Here we have Jewish leaders trying to kill Paul, stopping at nothing to try to achieve it, and Festus is able to establish good working relations and willing to compromise justice. And King Agrippa is also working his angles. But Paul is able to subvert their intentions by appealing to a higher court. He appeals to Caesar the emperor, but as fellow believers and understanding Paul's priorities, we understand that Paul is also appealing and putting his faith in God as the higher power, that God would use him for his purposes. We know that Paul's not necessarily seeking freedom, but rather seeking to follow God's instruction to get to Rome, to testify about Jesus there, and therefore glorify the true and living God. Christians have the privilege of appealing to the highest court that is always open. They will always hear the plea of the innocent, to the true emperor of all, who loves and upholds justice. He is just. He cannot be manipulated or coerced or bribed, but he gives mercy upon those he chooses to give mercy. So Christians, therefore, must not become intimidated or withdrawn from our responsibilities to our true King, the Lord Jesus Christ, and service to his kingdom. Yes, we need to discharge our responsibilities as good citizens in the land, but also to remember that our ultimate loyalties, our ultimate allegiance lies with the Lord Jesus and with the kingdom of heaven.